welcome to the Covert Attack Mystery Box talk. I hope that's the one you expected to be in, because that's where you're at. So Mike and I started working on this talk, I don't know, maybe half a year ago, and it started out as a completely different idea. We were trying to go with a mining theme, and so we started out with like this cryptocurrency kind of thing, but then we decided that we wanted to work on some other stuff, and we came up with a bunch of other really kind of novel techniques that we kind of threw together. And so I was like, hey, have you ever heard of like a subscription box, like these like loot crates, you know?
Never heard of them.
Like, what if we threw together like a loot crate of sorts of Microsoft exploits?
So I had to look up what Loot Crate was. I had no idea, and I was fascinated with it, and so we decided to go with that.
So that's kind of what this is. It's a mystery box. You're at the live unboxing of our little mystery box. We're gonna show you a bunch of stuff we've been working on over the last few years, and well, mainly last year, last couple weeks even. So who are we? Mike Felch.
You stay ready on Twitter. I'm gonna hold that. So I'm a pen tester, red teamer with Black Hills. Closer. And yeah, so I was involved with OWASP Orlando for a while, and still technically involved with my friends from B-Sides Orlando. And with Beau, we do Tradecraft Security, or actually he does Tradecraft Security Weekly. I just kind of piggyback it.
Whatever.
It's kind of cool. And then we both are co-hosts of CoinSec Podcast, which is a cryptocurrency. We just talk about the security implications of it and whatever. So. Yep.
And I'm Beau Bullock, Daft Hack on Twitter. Also pen tester, red teamer at Black Hills Information Security. And like you said, we do a few podcasts. And I always include this avid OA enthusiast in my profile because that's just what I like to focus on. It's fun stuff. So what are we covering today? So like I said, it's going to be a mystery box of sorts. We're going to have a bunch of items that I'm not going to tell you what they are right now. I'll give you this. There's one that's got to do with attribution. There's one that has to do with recon. There's some persistence, which actually that third one is more of like a persistence / exploitation method. And then the fourth one is, I think it's like the candy of all this. It's like the gem.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So, and I don't know if we're going to have time for questions. So I think if you want to write down a note and find us afterwards, we're going to cover a lot of stuff in this talk. And it's going to be very content-filled. So we're going to try to get through it as quick as we can. So hopefully we'll have some time for questions. But just, yeah, write them down. Find us later. We'll be around. OK, so mystery box item number 1. The curious case of event logs with no attribution. OK, so at Black Hills, we work with a lot of different customers with very extremely vast different ways that they go about logging things. We work with some customers who do basically no logging at all. They don't have any visibility into what's happening on their endpoints, what's happening on their domain. And then we work with the extreme other side of things where we have customers that are logging literally every single thing that you could have possibly imagined on their systems and on their network, and they're alerting on all kinds of stuff. So one of the things that we do on pretty much every pen test is password spraying attacks. You've probably heard us talk about it in every single webcast, every single talk we've ever done, because it's so successful for us. It's something we do all the time. If you haven't heard us talk about it, the concept is basically we run one password attempt per user for every single user. So the idea would be like, I will take the password winter 2018, and I'll try it against every user in your domain. And that way, I'm not going to lock anyone out, but it gives me a greater chance of finding somebody who has that weak password. And potentially, I'll be able to use that account for other things on your domain. So one of the tools that I wrote, it's a password spraying tool in PowerShell called Domain Password Spray. So this script is something that basically just hits your DC, and we had a customer that alerted on this. A very awesome customer who actually is here. And they alerted on this, and we started looking at the events that it was generating and trying to just, I don't know, maybe try to get around that somehow. Like we tried to we were on a purple team, and we're trying to find ways to evade that detection. Like what's another way we could perform the same type of activity, like password spraying, and not get caught? So what are some other protocols on your network that are using Active Directory authentication that we could try to hit? So one of the ones that first came to mind was, hey, OA. Yeah, I'm an avid OA enthusiast, so what about it? So Outlook Web Access actually logs at IIS and not in the Windows security logs, where a lot of people are looking. A lot of organizations are just looking at the Windows security event logs for failed logons. And so you know, that's one of those things that's like, that works to get around if you're just looking at the Windows security event logs. But like all of you that are here, we have a lot of customers who come to our talks and see us talk about things like Mail Sniper and other tools that we've written, and we've come up with people, or we've had organizations that detect this already. And so we were like, okay, well, where else could we try authenticating? What about RDP? You know, like, what does RDP look like if you try to password spray RDP? So we tested with X-Free RDP, which is a Linux tool against the RDP server, and we started looking at some of the logs, and to our surprise, there was no IP address of the source of the attacker in the logs, in the event logs. Okay, that's kind of weird. The host name was there in the event log as a failed login, but there was no IP address. And so I started looking at some of the options for X-Free RDP, and there's actually an option in there to set the client host name too. So not only can I not have my IP in the logs, but I can set my host name to whatever I want it to be. Okay. So we started looking at how could we password spray using that kind of method. And in doing some more research, I learned more about NLA, network layer authentication. So RDP servers that utilize network layer authentication don't actually log IP address, and there's a reason for this. So NLA does this pre-authentication prior to actually giving you that GUI access to RDP. So if you ever go to like RDP to a system and you get that credential prompt where it's not like the actual GUI like window with your like Microsoft logon, that's NLA working for you. It's pre-authenticating you. It's supposed to be more secure. Like you're not actually hitting the GUI. So anyways, when it does that, it generates an applications and services log, not a Windows security event log. So this is allegedly where it's supposed to be. Like, so, you know, doing some research, like, okay, the IP's not here, where's it at? Okay, so what about this applications and services log? So we started looking at that. So this is what it should look like. So it's an event ID 140 for a failed NLA authentication via RDP. Now, this is a very, very misleading log. So if you read the actual content of this log, it says a connection from the client computer with an IP address of da-da-da-da-da failed because the username or password is not correct. So in testing this out, this is extremely misleading. In testing this out, it turns out that it only logs this if the username is invalid. So if you submit a valid username and an invalid password, this log does not get generated. So as long as I have your domain user list, there is no failed event log that you can find with my IP address in it if I try to authenticate via RDP with NLA. So I have a demo of this. Okay, so our attacker's IP is 192.168.88.245, and I'm going to show how a typical remote desktop event log should look using just our desktop. So our desktop doesn't actually utilize NLA by default. It uses TLS. So we create a failed login. Now let's go check out the event log. So we'll refresh in the console, and then go to the log, and scroll down, and you should see our IP address of the attacker. So yeah, you see the username, unknown, or username or bad password, and then the IP address of the attacker. This is like what you would typically expect when somebody does a failed logon on your networks, right? I mean, you would hope that like you get their IP address. Okay, so now let's go do an RDP logon with a tool I wrote. Well, it's a script that I'm going to show you how we can change, or we can set host names too. So this is a list of fake host names that we're going to send to the server. And then I'm going to show you my domain username list as well. So this is just a quick little proof of concept to kind of show how this works. Basically what I did is I took the tool hostnamectl and X-Free RDP, and I just wrapped them in Python. And I'm going to just run through password spraying against RDP, where I'm using hostnamectl to change the host name on every single RDP attempt. And you can see here, like, cred probably valid, but not allowed to RDP. The reason I put not allowed to RDP there is because these credentials were successful, but they don't actually have access to RDP to that system. So we can tell if a username and password was valid on the domain. But here, check this out. So now we go look at the logs. And we see workstation name share5, source network address, nothing. Okay, what about the next one? Host name, or workstation name, share1. No network address. And just for good measure, let's do a third one. Workstation name, don't look here. Source network address, nothing. So you get the picture. I mean, we're password spraying. And I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, where's it coming from? So we go look at the application and services logs, and I'll show you here that there's no event ID 140s either because we're using valid usernames. All right, back to the presentation. Okay, so what's next? So what I would like to do, like I said, that was just a quick little proof of concept to kind of show how that would work. I want to actually build a standalone tool that works in Windows from either PowerShell or C# and add additional functionality to find NLA-enabled RDP, because the other thing is how do you detect this or stop this? So Windows Server 2016 actually does log the source IP. So this is the recommendation here. Make sure you're on Server 2016. Server 2012 R2 and back, you're going to have a bad day, but you can do a little bit of correlation between applications and services logs that actually show where a user connected in that applications and services log, but it doesn't actually tell you that the username or password is invalid. So you'd have to correlate that with one of those failed logon events with the fake host names. So it might be worth looking at like firewall logs too. And now on to mystery box item number 2. Yep.
All right, cool. The other thing that I like about that is you could find servers on their network and then just act like you're RDPing from their server. I think that's a cool little trick. Make the triage team kind of run to the wrong server. Okay, so cool. So we're going to talk about the mysterious Azure Active Directory sync. Some of you might have seen the blog post that we put out recently on this. A lot of people aren't really aware of this. This is the reason why I think we should probably talk about this a lot more. And so the first thing that I really wanted to talk about is external Active Directory. Being able to query Active Directory for information within an organization. So you could identify everybody in the organization. You could identify all of the groups, all of the group memberships. You could create guest accounts, and that's really just where we're going to dig into this a little bit. And you could do this with like a low-level set of credentials, and you could do it externally. So you don't actually have to be on the internal network in order to hit Active Directory, which I think is pretty awesome. And so just a quick glimpse, the way that this works is if you're familiar with DirSync on Active Directory, this is kind of like the traditional way of syncing Active Directories using the domain controllers. And then they moved to this thing called Azure Active Directory Sync. And then that just gave it so that you could expose your Active Directory users externally in the Azure kind of cloud atmosphere or environment in order to kind of allow self-service for applications or third-party tools to use single sign-on. And so, and then you might also know Forefront Identity Manager, and which is more of just like the identity and access management for Azure. And so what Microsoft done is combined all of these to this new idea called Azure AD Connect. And like I said, it just gives you the ability to have single sign-on federation kind of with all your Office 365 or your Exchange Online or any of the services that you would use that you're trying to expose your Active Directory users so you could still manage them on-prem, but not have the risks of being on the internal network, which sounds great, right? The way that this works is on-prem uses this idea that it's the Azure AD Connect Sync Engine, and that Sync Engine does some stuff, and then it syncs with the service, which is actually sitting in Azure. And so the way that it does this is it uses this Azure password hashing. And so the concept is pretty simple, straightforward. It takes the MD4 hash of the user's password, it has a salt, and then it SHA-256 is that hash, and then it synchronizes it with the domain controller, sends it to the Azure environment. And the reason why it does the hash of a hash is that way we could prevent like pass the hash. And so it's pretty straightforward. The envelope gets decrypted with the salt, and then it stores that hash internally within Azure. That way it's not actually communicating with your on-prem immediately. And it does require like a second authentication if you're logging into like your webmail portal or if you're logging into Azure portal, which is what we're going to show. It basically takes that MD4, it takes a user-supplied password, it takes the salt, it sends it to like a HMAC SHA-256, and then it compares the stored hash with the user-supplied hash that was synced earlier by the domain controller, and then it creates a session, and that's pretty much the life cycle. So what does this mean? It actually means with a single set of credentials that we've either sprayed, like Beau was talking about earlier, or that we phished with a tool like CredSniper, you could actually identify all the users and read the permissions the same way that you would if you were sitting on the Active Directory. So sometimes you'll see Help Desk will store notes within Active Directory for user accounts. We found passwords. I think Sally brought this up to my attention a while back at Black Hills. Like, you could look at Active Directory properties on users and find, you know, gems of information. You could also identify security groups. This is where I usually go. So if I could phish or password spray a standard user, I immediately go to Azure, because now my reconnaissance incorporates identifying target groups, because I love to target backend engineers, senior developers. Most people don't like that because they're, you know, you would have this, we're all tech savvy, so we tend to have this heightened security in our mind, but it's really not the case when you walk into a really well put phish. And so I could identify the groups that they're a part of, the ones that I want to target, because backend engineers and developers are going to have more access than standard users. And a lot of the senior level, depending on the corporation culture, are more than willing to help other employees, which is, I think, fascinating, because I leverage that in order to further pivot into the organization. You could also identify other attack surfaces. So within Azure, you could register applications, and these might be internal applications or they might be third parties. But the idea is that we're allowing these third-party services to communicate with our Active Directory Azure instance for our single sign-on, because our employees need to be able to do that. You might find Salesforce is there. And now you know that you use third-party services. Sometimes you don't have to go internal to the network ever. We've been in on engagements where we've actually compromised an entire organization externally just by pivoting around into their third-party services and situations like this. The other cool thing that I like about it is you can see the devices that all the employees are using, which means you can also see the Windows installation version, 1806. Or if it's back, you'll know that that installation on that device is running an unpatched version of Windows, which is really cool. Or you can see that they're syncing their phones with the portal, and they're running Android, and it's an older version of Android. But there's a bunch of that stuff that you could do there. The other thing that you could do is you could look at the other domains that are associated with it. You know, a lot of times we're looking at the corporate domain, but then developers might have stood up their own development domain where they're syncing their GitLab or their GitHub to that developer domain, and you can see other attack surfaces as well as the roles and scopes. Because once you're looking at the groups, not only do you know the groups, you could also look at the roles of the members of that group. And now remember, we're doing all of this from a limited access account. Or if we had an account, we could create a guest account and just log in with our own. And so that's really kind of the idea behind this. The other thing you could do is you could create a guest account and then add a multi-factor device if they have two-factor. So if you invite a user, and just depending on how the configuration is set up, we could actually VPN in if all the users and guest accounts get created in a VPN group, which we've seen. And so let's do it. So there's 3 different ways that we could connect to this. The first one that I originally found this on was just connecting to the Azure portal. I was trying to find out what services the user had access to, and it turns out that they have access to be able to just pivot into Azure, which going to portal.azure.com, logging in with those low-level creds, and then going straight to Azure Active Directory, and you see everything. I was having a really difficult time trying to get that data out, especially on organizations that have 20,000 employees. And so the way that we did it was I found this Azure CLI, very similar to the AWS CLI, but you just do AZ login. It prompts a browser open. You log in with your credentials, and then it authorizes that CLI instance with a valid session. And you could kind of just query from there. If you're a PowerShell fanatic, you could use Azure RM and do the exact same thing. I found that the Azure CLI is a little bit sketchy at times whenever you're trying to filter down. It's not super developed yet, but that's pretty much the nature of how you can connect to it. And so I do have a little demo here. Let me see if I can pull this up real quick. It's a pretty quick one. So the idea is I'm just logging in now. I'm using allow no subscriptions and use device code. Use device code, you take that code and you actually log in with the link that's there. So it'll open up, and the authentication will bring you to a page. You just push that. See, I'm already logged in the session. You see the Outlook on Office 365 in the background. But you take that code, you put it into the Azure prompt, and then it grants the access. You select the account. Beau stood up a nice domain for us. We have authenticated as Beau now. And so then it's going to authorize it. And so you see here, now we're going to run a list of all the logins or all the users that are a part of this Active Directory. And so it's going to kind of give you all the details. You could output it in JSON if you're developing a tool, which is really handy, or you could dump it to a table. But you see all of the permissions that from Active Directory. You see the phone numbers, the addresses. We see pretty much everything, the user principal name. We see their, all the stuff that they have access to, their sign-in names, pretty much everything that you would expect to see if you're using like AD Explorer on the internal network. And so using that, now we can look at the group of lists. This is usually what I do. Like these are the first things that I do. And then I find all of the groups, and I'm obviously looking for admin. I want to find the admin group because I want to find the members of that admin group. So we see that group. Nope, not that one. There we go. Vuln admins. This is interesting. So I take that object ID. I just copy it. And then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to do AZ AD group members list and then pass it that group ID. And it's going to give me all of the members within Active Directory where they're a part of that group. And you'll see we have a domain admin that's there. And then, oh, by the way, looks like we have Beau in the list as well, somewhere up here. And so that's pretty much the nature of how we could leverage this to kind of pivot into an environment. I'm just going to cut that now because I want to get through the rest of this stuff. And so I just screwed up. How do I get back there? Can you take it? I can't do it with my right hand. And then go into presenter. So the problem with this was we were trying to find what do you do about this, right? So that we had some talks when we put the blog out there. It looks like in the Azure portal, you could turn off portal access by going into the configuration as admin and just disabling it. The problem with that is if you look in the top right, it doesn't work for CLI or the PowerShell. And so we were like, well, what are we going to do? Well, the way that you have to do this is you have to set up AZ conditional access rules in order to disable somebody from logging in from CLI. The problem that we ran into, though, is that you have to upgrade. So if you look down there at the bottom, it says that you have to have Azure AD Premium, which is an upgrade. So we brought it back to the company, and we were like our internal, because we use Office 365, and we were trying to find how to fix this problem. And it turns out Derek Roush was able to find a backup shortcut, which was really helpful for us to be able to disable the ability to have users read other users' data. It doesn't stop all the other information. You can still see groups, and you can see applications and domains and stuff, but that's pretty much the nature of how you have to fix it if you're not going to upgrade.
All right. All right, so here's mystery box item number 3. What are we pulling out now? So this one is called the force-fed Microsoft Outlook hook. All right, so O365 creds, now what? So let's say again, back to password spraying. You're going to see this recurring theme through a lot of what we do. So let's say we got a cred somehow, password spraying, maybe we phished a cred, we have access to somebody's credential at your organization, and you're an O365 shop. So from the external side, I mean, O365 is pretty vast. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. You can go look through SharePoint, you can look through Azure, like you just mentioned, like find the groups, and there's a lot of enumeration you could do there. One of the things that we used to do, but it's since been patched, is the quote-unquote ruler attack, which is where you basically install your own Outlook client and then add your own malicious rules in, and they sync across the internet to your victim's Outlook client. And so that's not a thing anymore. So let's talk about something kind of new, kind of similar. So have anyone heard of Microsoft add-ins? No? Nobody? Okay, well then you're about to learn a lot about those. Okay, so Microsoft add-ons are essentially what it sounds like. They're additional functionality that you can add to various Microsoft products. And it's not just Outlook, you can add them to Word, SharePoint, all kinds of different services. So there are 2 types of different Outlook add-ins. There's the traditional or legacy COM style or VSTO add-ins, which are basically ones you would install on your desktop. So if you have like the desktop Outlook client, you would install one of these add-ins, and it literally installs code on your system. Or the newer ones are these web add-ins. And so the web add-ins, there's no code that's actually installed on your client. You add it in via the browser. So you log into the Outlook web client, and you go to install the add-in, which I'll show here in a second, and it literally points to a file on the internet. You upload this manifest.xml file that has this pointer to a web server where you host your code. So the web add-ins sync across sessions, not only to the web clients, but to the desktop clients too. So if I get access to a credential, and I add my own add-in, it syncs everywhere. I'll give you a second. All right, so here's the attack path, right? All right, an attacker gets a cred. We add in our malicious add-in. and it's going to sync to your browser, to your desktop client, and let's see what kind of what can we do with that. So first of all, there's some hurdles to jump. Does the user have to click something? No, they don't, which is even more fun. So when you install an add-in, it shows up as like this little icon, like kind of when you open up an email, typically the traditional way is it kind of creates you this little icon that you can change to whatever you want, and you click it, and then it runs your add-in. So typically the user would have to click that. But thankfully to Microsoft, they gave us pinnable task panes. So we can now just pin that straight to our email, and it just runs. Like, so you open up an email, and it literally just runs the add-in. And the other thing, the pinnable task panes sync across web browsers too. So all I have to do now, as an attacker, is point the manifest file that I upload to my code on the internet, which is it's hosting a web server, and that can be HTML, JavaScript, whatever you want. And the Outlook desktop client, so I would note here is that the Outlook desktop client uses Edge. So like if you use the Outlook desktop client, the actual browser is using Edge. So let's walk through a few examples here. So how do you install an add-in? So first, you go to the settings in Outlook. You click Manage Add-ins. Then you go over to this the Custom Add-ins spot down there where you see the plus sign, Add a Custom Add-in, and then you add from file. And with that file, you're essentially just uploading your manifest.xml file, which you can generate with Visual Studio. So Visual Studio already has the template for it, for creating an Outlook web add-in. You can go into Visual Studio, pop out a quick Outlook web add-in, which includes your manifest. It'll include the HTML files for creating a very basic add-in. And you host the HTML files on your web server. You point the domain and stuff in the manifest file at your server. And it does require HTTPS. Microsoft's trying to be secure, so you can't just host it on an HTTP site. So there's yay Microsoft. So here's an idea. This one is Mike's. So Mike actually showed me this to begin with, like this whole idea of doing add-ins. And his idea was, what if we just backdoored their email? Like what if we just created an add-in that just sent us the content of every single email that they got? Like that's a quick and easy backdoor. You lose access. Like let's say they change their password, but that add-in keeps sending you their email. That's pretty nice. So we have some proof of concept code to share later on that does this on the desktop client very easily, where on the desktop client it literally just forwards emails as they come into your inbox. Like you don't even have to have them open. Like it pops in the inbox, comes to me. So I started looking a little further. What else could we do? What if we could hook their browser with Beef? It works. So get this. I create an add-in that literally just points to my Beef hook. It syncs across the internet to my victim's browser. They log in for work for the day, open up the next email, bam, Beef hooked. Yeah, it's good stuff. So with Beef has a lot of different plugins. So a number of different things that are already part of Beef. And this is a great example of how you could literally get code execution in a browser across the internet. I mean, like doing things like enumerating the local system. You can actually have them browse to whatever link you want. You can start doing some local LAN enumeration. You can serve up more files. Like what if I just served up HTAs through Beef? Like I can just make it pop up in your client. It's great. So this is something we literally just did last week. So we need more research time to figure out like what implications, what else we can do with this. But yeah, that's one thing. Probably my favorite is to just start mining cryptocurrency in the browser. So CoinHive is JavaScript-based miner.
Or in the Outlook client.
Yeah, or in the Outlook desktop client. So what about deploying it across everyone? So as an O365 admin, you can create these add-ins in the admin portal and deploy it to every employee at the organization and make it mandatory so they can't even uninstall it. So anyways, use your imagination how bad that could be. So let me show you a demo. All right, so pretend we're the attacker. We fished a cred. We're about to log into our Outlook portal. We fished Beau at blueteam.lol's email in his password. So we're going to log in on the attacker side. All right. Logged into Outlook, and Now let's go ahead and create our add-in. So we go to settings, and we're going to manage our add-ins. And then click on My Add-ins, and then down at the bottom, you'll see Add Custom Add-ins, Add a Custom Add-in. So we click that, Add from File, and we're going to upload our manifest.xml file. Now remember, this is all on the attacker side. So this is installing the add-in in my browser, right? So it's currently installed, well, it's installed for the user. And if we go open up an email, you'll see a little icon now. So we got this little icon, that's the add-in, right? So if I click that, it runs my add-in. And you'll see kind of in the background here in a second, over to the left, see the thing that just popped up over to the left, or to the right? That's Beef hooking my browser right now, currently. So that's just showing like, okay, I added my add-in, it works. I'm now Beef hooked myself. Okay, so let's go ahead and see, yep, Beef hooked the browser. So now let's pin it and go over to the victim side. So this would be the victim logging into Outlook for the day. They're going to log in for work. Check some email. See if they got any sweet memes, any cat pics.
You could make that panel too. There's some work that you could do to make that panel so it's hidden.
Yes, yeah. So there's that, yeah. That's the other thing we should definitely mention is that this is mostly a demo just to show how this is working. You can hide that panel. So you'll see whenever they just click an email. That's all they did. Click an email, open an email, hands off, add in, pops in now-ish. No, there it is. So add in pops. So that's synced across all the browser sessions. Anytime they go to log in, there's a new session. And hey, Beef hooked their browser across the internet. That's awesome. Thanks, Microsoft. Okay, so let's just show some quick examples of what you could do with a Beef hook. Like this, there's a lot of things you can do with Beef. This is just a quick example just to show it's actually working in the browser. So let's send a very generic credential prompt. So this is like your standard Windows credential. Hey, you've been logged out of the network, log in. And you can see over here, we got the credential prompt. So give me your creds. And I just type like user test, user pass, and it should get sent over, or test user, test passing, should get sent over to the server side. So Beef is working. Nothing to see here. Go back over, check the log, and username and password are there. Okay, so let's have some more fun. Like I said, like we have a podcast about cryptocurrency security. So why don't we mine some cryptocurrency? I mean, it seems to be the hot thing these days, right? It's like the latest. It's the most like I guess notorious malware out there, CoinHive at this point. So what I'm doing is I'm actually using, what I just did there is I stopped Apache and I started Nginx because I'm actually going to use a reverse proxy through Nginx to the CoinHive mining pools. And the reason I do that is because of cross-domain policy. So anything that I need to serve up to that victim has to come to my domain that I've already hooked. So I'm sending them back to my webhook that I'm hosting, which has CoinHive. So in order to see if CoinHive is working, let's go to the Developer Tools console. So that if you open up Developer Tools console, you can actually see, hey, CoinHive's working in the browser. We're mining cryptocurrency. Win Lambo. All right, so thanks for the nightmares. What now? Well, so this all comes back to credentials, to be honest. And it's honestly, we spent a good amount of time trying to think what's the best way to fix this.
How do we fix it? Where do we find information to fix it?
So looking around in the admin portal, I don't actually see a way. I mean, if somebody knows how to do this in O365 portal, please come up and tell me because I'm really curious. I could not find a way that you can prevent or remove an add-in from one of your users' clients. Like, I don't see a way to do it. So the way to actually... So John says, is there a way to query what's installed? I don't see that either. I mean, yeah. So for us right now, like the best fix I have is 2FA and have a strong password policy. And hope your users aren't installing CoinHive in their browser. All right.
All right, cool.
I think this one is like, I don't know, the icing on the cake of all these. So
this one was fun. So we ended up, I went to Black Hat, and if anybody went to Black Hat, there was a talk by Alex Ionscu and Gabriela Vayala on like kind of an untapped attack surface kind of within the core kernel of Microsoft Windows. And they went over the data structures, and they went over the kind of concepts of how to interact with it and what it's capable of doing, and they really did a really great job of that. I wouldn't be able to have researched this if it wasn't for seeing their talk and them sharing their information. And so some of the stuff that we're going to talk about here is it's not patched by Windows. There's a lot of vulnerabilities here. We're not going to get into a lot of the vulnerabilities that are actually affecting the kernel or the services of Windows. I'm weaponizing some of the theories that they brought to the table that could be used for this. And once I saw it, it was inspiring. And so that's really what we're going to kind of step through a little bit. We're going to talk about Windows low-level kernel, but we're not going to get into the details. Like, we're just going to kind of do it from a summary. I don't want to make this a super technical. I want to make this more of applicable. And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is, what is this thing that I'm talking about? Is WNF. It's the Windows Notification Facility. And the idea behind this is it's a publish and subscribe subsystem of Windows at a really low level in the NTDLL. The idea behind it is it allows for dispatching of data and events to Windows processes. And it's across user mode and kernel mode. And so you have the ability to subscribe and get notified when an event changes within the Windows kernel. I think it started as Clippy, like way back in the day, and then they just said it was such an awesome idea, let's like make this forever. So they made it a part of the kernel, and it's super undocumented. You're not going to find anything, any documentation on WNF, and if you do, like, you're going to find it on a blog or some other information kind of about WNF. And so the idea behind it is you could subscribe to events within Windows, and you don't ever have to have anything pubbed before, right? So you could just subscribe and then wait. So if you're waiting on some hardware to load, when that hardware loads, it notifies the Windows kernel. The Windows kernel says, hey, who's all subscribed to this event? And let me call back the callback functions in the context of those processes so that they can continue doing their job. And that's kind of the nature of what WNF is. And so it uses these things called state names. And these state names are stored in the registry. And what they do is they're basically the way that you could subscribe to a certain event. So the event that you're subscribing to is actually the state name. And so the state name is it's a GUID, but it's an encoded data structure, and that encoded data structure outlines a few different things. So it's a 64-bit GUID structure that's stored in the registry, and it contains the lifetime of that state, that event. And so that the main one is well-known ones. They're technically called well-known. And these well-known states are reserved by Windows for Windows. And so you can't register them. They're already pre-registered with Windows, and they come depending on the build. And then there's permanent ones, and these ones stay kind of across the bound of a reboot, right? So in the event where the machine is rebooted, that state name stays persisting within Windows. And then there's the volatile ones, which they're bound to the reboot of the machine. So once it's rebooted, that state name disappears. And then there's temporary ones, and these are ones like you could create or I could create. And the idea is that I could have a process that runs within Windows, create a state name that's temporary that nobody knows about. And I could set the scope of it, which is another part of the state name. The state name talks about like whether it's over the user boundary, the process boundary, the session boundary, or whether it's just global for the whole machine. And they do come with security descriptors, but what you're going to see, they're not used. I mean, some of them are used, but most of the security descriptors, if you're familiar with like DACL, so access control lists for certain functionality of Windows, like they have that ability, so they're really powerful. But most of them aren't using. And so what we're going to be doing is kind of stepping through these. So these GUID structures are XORed with a state key. I don't have the key in here, but you don't really need it. It's there, but it's public information. And so there's some other information about these state names that are there too, like version information, the scope of the data, which we just talked about. But then there's a permanent flag of whether it's like well-known or volatile. And then there's like a unique identifier, which basically so you could have multiple ones, I guess, whatever. And so then the idea behind this is that the kernel itself, the Windows kernel, at a low level uses the ZW API function calls within the native API. And so the NTDLL subscribes to the events because technically you're only supposed to have like one process per state subscribing. And then what NTDLL does is it exposes the API wrapper at a higher level, like the RTL and the EX functions within the NTDLL, so that users can create processes that subscribe to them. And then what happens is basically whenever that event gets triggered, NTDLL is notified, and then NTDLL kind of like multiplexes to all the subscribers kind of across the board. The cool thing with this is the Windows kernel actually goes to that process, and it maintains the list of these callbacks and the contexts. It switches context, and then it executes the callback functions. So you can imagine like having a process delegating like a function that you want, calling the low level or calling the API in NTDLL, telling the kernel, hey, when this event triggers, call this code in my code. And so then you get code execution. Now, the idea behind this, because the NTDLL exposes a higher level wrapper, what it does is it actually can track on the event logs. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to stay a little bit lower in the kernel so that we're not actually in the event logs at all. Which makes, if you're an endpoint, like an EDR provider, this is scary, right? Because now what do? Because now we have a way to create like an IPC mechanism, an inter-process call, across processes, across user boundaries and kernel boundaries, and we can hide data, we can hide binaries and other files, we can inject code and processes if we can hijack their vtable, for instance. If we can find the vtable entry for that callback context in that process from a userland process that's persistent, like maybe, I don't know, ThinkPad, startup process or something, because we know those are like .NET files. So if you can find the vtable entry for the callback function, when the Windows API kernel calls that callback function, you're actually redirecting code execution. It's a known vulnerability in most like vtable hijacks. But the idea is that you could redirect the code to yours, and so you don't even have to worry about like writing to disk, which is what I'm going to do to demo this. But there's other research here that hasn't been tapped yet. Is basically where I'm getting to. And so now we're able to push code, and obviously that's what malware likes to do. So how do we do this? So within the kernel, I'm going to look at some of the low-level API calls. Here's 4 of them right here. The first one's query. So whenever you're wanting to consume data, remember these state IDs, these state names actually have data payloads that are associated with them. Because it's not just, hey, this event was triggered. It's, hey, this event was triggered, and I don't know, here's the pointer, or here's the data payload for the configuration, or here's the last host that was browsed in Edge, or it's across the board depending on the events that you're looking at. And so the cool thing with this is you could actually consume those data payloads from states without ever subscribing. And if we don't use the RTL functions and we use the ZW query function, it's not going to be picked up by Windows. And so what do you do about that? Like, I know it's crazy. You could actually get data we could ask the kernel to get us the data, and then it sends that payload back to us. If you want, you could also update those state names. Now think about that for a second. A state name, if the DACL's not correct and it has everyone on that's allowed, which most of them are, you'll see, even the well-known ones that are reserved by the Windows kernel, allow you to update those state names. And what you're basically saying is, hey, I'm updating the data payload of this state name so that any of the Windows services, I don't know, like the ones that are running kind of with Windows, when they consume that event and they look at that payload, it actually gets code, you get code, or you're injecting data into that process. And this is an untapped attack surface. There's no fuzzers that are out there really for this yet. And so if you're starting to hook, if you do like any kernel debugging and you want to hook the Windows kernel and then subscribe to these, I just subscribed to all of the different events. And then when we were doing the research to try to figure out like where things were flaky and what was breaking, you're going to break stuff immediately. If you just query all of them, you're going to see like potentially information disclosure, like process information across boundaries that you shouldn't see. And these are the ones that Windows are trying to actively fix. I know Alex and Gabriella reported a lot of these vulnerabilities. So what you're going to see is they didn't release any code yet because it's still such a volatile area of research that's kind of scary. And then you can also create new state names. So you can call ZW create WNF state names and create your own. This is where it gets really cool because you can create your own, and there's nothing to monitor. Like, what do you monitor? Nobody knows about it. You have to like brute force the state names to find them. And then you could delete them so whenever you're done. So like, I don't know, if you hooked like a shutdown process and then created your state and made it volatile, and then whenever the machine started, you hooked the startup process and then deleted the delete state name. So it's like, you're completely hiding behind the scenes. It's kind of the idea. So what I did when we started this was I didn't have anything to go off of besides their Black Hat presentation, and then I found like a blog on Red Plate, some Red Plate blog that was kind of random. Somebody user posted a bunch of information. So what I wanted to do is kind of give you like at least a starting point. So if you wanted to look more into this, you could. This is, I think, if you have this screenshot, if you want to take a picture of it real quick. You can find all the state names in the registry. So, so in the notifications, and then you'll see that the very bottom one, like the volatile notifications, are the ones that are like volatile that deleted. And then you have the internal state names. So if you're looking for the internal state names, and bear in mind these are like ulong 64, IDs. It's really hard to differentiate between what state is doing what and what event is being triggered. So if you look at Microsoft's ADK, which is like, it's a way to analyze the entire processing of the Windows machine at any given time. There's a DLL file in there called perf_nt_c.dll, and it has all of the internal Microsoft like friendly names, so you could see like, oh, this is a shutdown state, but it also gives you a really cool description associated with it. And there's some other ones too that I didn't put in here that got released yesterday. Actually, Gabrielle made a blog post yesterday on more in-depth WNF functions on how to research from the kernel side. So that's really cool. I definitely recommend checking that out. And then the other thing that you could do is I was looking for the signatures, the native API call signatures within the kernel. And so if you go to processhacker.sourceforge.io, you can go to the NTZW API, and what it does is it actually breaks down all the signatures for you. So if you just search for like WNF, you can see all the internal or the input parameters, the output parameters, because what you're going to want to do, like if you're going to do it like me, you can do it in C++. I tried that first, but it was really hard to get some of the other functionality that I wanted. So I ported my code to C#. And then I created some functions that imported from the NTDLL, and so I needed those signatures so that I could find the right data types in C#. And so I put together this tool. This is what Beau and I use for research, because there was no code put out by Alex. Now he has a tool that's going to be that's going to be released called WNF Dump. And he's going to be releasing it after Windows patches. So out of respect for his research, since we're really standing on their shoulders, I'm not going to release Casper until after they release theirs, just out of respect because I want Microsoft to have time to patch it as well. But this tool right here is what we use to kind of do it. So you see the friendly names over on the far left. Then the registry names, it's stored in the registry in that way, but if you look at the decoded name, you'll see it there. You'll see the lifetime of it, whether there's subscribers for it already, the data length, and if you look over here, this is actually the last known payload for these state names, and so it gets pretty crazy. So I'll release this. I have it on SourceForge already, or not SourceForge, GitHub. Sorry. Yeah, I see that. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to create a side channel data persistence. So we're going to get code execution. Our stage 1 payload is just going to be a dropper. It's going to basically check to see if the stage 2 payload is already stored in another state name. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our actual malware and store it in, and have the Windows kernel store it for us. And then if it's there, we're going to run it. If it's not, we're going to fetch it from C2, and then we're going to store it, and then we're going to run it. We're going to also we can subscribe to the shutdown and user presence events. So when the machine shuts down, we'll write it to disk. When it starts up, we'll delete it off disk. That way, because it's such an early and late event call within the Windows kernel, we'll be able to leverage that in order to keep malware analysts off the machine. They're going to have to find other ways to do it. They're great at it. I suck at it, so it doesn't matter. And then we're also going to monitor the user presence, right? So the user presence is going to tell us when the user is there. Microsoft uses AI to determine whether or not the user is sitting at the machine. So when they're there, we're going to change the jitter, or we're just going to nuke the box or something because there's some vulnerabilities within Windows. If they're not there, we could do something like we could increase the jitter, we could get our C2 channel going and whatnot. So this is just an overview of what I just said. Here are the shutdown state, the user presence state, and the nuke the box state. That's just basically kind of what we're going to do. And then I'm just going to demo it real quick. This is pretty much this right here. It's the stage 1. C2, storing it in we're having the Windows kernel do all this for us, right? All right, so this is probably going to be pretty short. This is our Windows machine. I'm going to run the dropper. You see the dropper's querying the Windows kernel. It's saying, hey, we found malware here. It's decompressing it, It's actually putting it together, and then it's subscribing to the user event. So the user just went to sleep, right? The user woke back up, and now what happens is we just nuked Windows from user land by writing 0-byte payloads to the Windows kernel, and we just updated all of the state names with a 0-byte payload, and we just basically nuked the entire box from user land. The only way to get this back is if you literally take the registry and copy it back over and rewrite it, so it's pretty bad.
So yeah, destroying a Windows system from user land without being an admin.
So the TLDR is we're screwed. Endpoint solutions can't really do anything about this. You could do some research on it if you want to check event tracing, and you could hook kernels so you're trying to actually identify what's there. But if you're an endpoint solution, I don't think it's a really good idea to hook NTDLL. I think that's just a bad idea. Unless you're writing malware, then it's like a great idea. But then, and then the other thing that we could really try to do is monitor reads and writes, but you got to remember it's going to be from the service level account, so it's going to be super loud. You have to filter on certain entries. I don't know. I don't have a solution. I just have a problem. Normally, I try to bring a solution with the problem, but that was not really in our wheelhouse today. So hopefully, Microsoft can do this soon. And so just finishing up, these are just some requests that I think we had for Microsoft. This is kind of like the last of it. WNF documentation. Can we get some WNF? We don't know what this is doing. We want some native API logging or something. I don't know. What else we can do. We're calling native APIs. Can we have the Azure portal locked down by default? And then let's have additional conditional access within Active Directory without having to have the upgrade cost. That's kind of it seems pretty straightforward. I don't know. And then fix the phantom host info with the RDP NLA. I think they did that in 2016, but can we maybe get a backport of that fix? And then make it easy for O365 admins to find the rogue admins.
And, yep.
Yeah, so we could bypass the event logs, anything within the Windows environment, if we're dealing with the ZW, the low-level API calls. Yeah, event logs and sysmon. Yeah.
And with that, we're out of time, guys. So if you want to ask questions, come find us afterwards. Thank you so much.